Welcome to Under the Rug at Work, where we shine light on things that are normally swept under the rug. Today, I'm chatting with Cameron Carr about when inclusion leaves you out. Cameron is a retired Paralympian speaker and the director of Perception Performance. Cam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Nicole. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, I think I almost stuffed that up when you were speaking at the summit last time as well. We'll keep
I didn't
going.
realize it was such a tongue twister.
Now let's just call out the elephant in the room before we get started. Why is a white guy talking about D&I, and how did you come to focus on inclusion and performance?
That's a really good question, that first part, especially given that we're doing this via, Zoom, the chat, so you don't get the full view of me. So a little bit about my background is that, growing up um, in Queensland, I wanted to be a rugby league player. That's where I had my focus and dream set. Then I had a car accident at 19, and that car accident, I broke my neck, and I have been in a wheelchair ever since. So for the last almost 30 years. So can't believe we're there. I remember being in hospital and meeting someone that'd been in a wheelchair for 6 months. I'm like, well, that's not going to be me. That's crazy. 6 months. Yeah. So yeah, we're heading towards the 30-year mark. So that's why me as a middle-aged white man, I feel I'm somewhat uh, um, I can somewhat talk about the inclusion and diversity,
Yeah, I
or
love
however they
that.
want to. Yeah.
Yeah, and your background and experience is quite significant. You've worked in a number of organizations. Did you want to mention any of those or the industries at all?
Yeah, I think, look, I forgot I failed to continue asking the second part of that first
Oh,
question, which was in regards to, inclusion and performance, and how,
yeah,
why I've landed on that, why I'm really passionate about, making sure that when we're looking at or talking about inclusion, we're also talking about performance and challenging individuals from diversity groups to perform and holding them accountable to do so.
yeah,
Um, so for me, like I said, I grew up wanting to play rugby league. Everything was performance based and driven, I suppose. Being somewhat competitive, you wanted to get an advantage, and that advantage was to make sure that you're preparing yourself the best you could. Um,
mm,
so I suppose that's where the performance side comes from. And then following my car accident, there was a couple of very dark years there. But when I finally sort of came out of those, that it was wheelchair rugby that sort of got me out of that. And I spent probably the better part of 12 or 13 years on the national wheelchair rugby team. Playing representing Australia and going to a number of Paralympic games. So
mm,
that's my performance focus and passion.
yeah,
And then it was probably the transition from sport or life after sport into employment or meaningful employment for me, and not the stereotypical norm for someone in a wheelchair when it
hmm
comes to employment. And I was really um, I became really aware of some of the barriers that have been put in place either by society itself or the organisations in terms of attracting um, potential candidates with a disability.
yeah,
Um, so it took me quite a number of years. I thought I'd prepared for life after sport. I did everything that I was told to do. I had, you know, multiple degrees.
hmm
I thought I was ready to go, but no, I just couldn't land a job that
mm,
I was going to feel going to fulfill me or challenge me the way that sport did. And eventually,
mm,
after a number of years trying, I landed a role with Anglo American, a multinational mining company. But I had to take a graduate role.
hmm
So I was a 41-year-old graduate, which is, on top of being someone with a disability going into a landscape not really designed for people in wheelchairs, also being an older
yeah.
graduate as well, had some sort of complexities about it.
Do you think it was
Um,
discrimination that stopped you from coming out of the Paralympics and getting employed? I remember because we've done some work together. You were part of the Back on Track program that
yeah,
I developed back in the day. And I remember seeing you out after an event that we did, and three taxis pulled over thinking it was for me. And when they realized it was for you, they drove off. And that was horrible. I couldn't believe that. And that's something that you actually weren't as phased as I was because it's not you'd experienced it before. I know this kind of I wasn't prepared for this question, but I just wanted
yeah,
to
no, that's
the thoughts.
a good analogy of life, actually, and some of the organisations that I felt that did that. So,
Mm,
um, when I landed the role at Anglo, I'd actually removed any reference to me being in a wheelchair.
yeah.
Whether it was coincidence or not, the first job that I applied for when I didn't mention my disability, I actually got the role. Um, and it was I turned up to the interview, and I think they may have got a surprise that someone in a wheelchair was there, but sometimes you feel that way that organisations do, like you said with a taxi, they see the disability and they drive off, metaphorically, because they probably see the challenges and
Mm,
see, okay, wow, this is going to be um, a lot more difficult, than just picking up an able-bodied passenger. When
mm,
in actual fact, we don't know. Yeah, putting a wheelchair in a car is different from someone stepping in, but it's very minor. And then you don't know what the behavior is going to be of those individuals, once you've collected them. So yeah, I think you raise a
yeah,
good story that I could, yeah, reflect on.
definitely. And it's something that you're
And
also
we're happy in society just to accept that. We just go, well, that's just the norm, and we're happy to
Mm.
allow that to happen.
Yes. There's so many the reason I'm pausing is there's so many directions that the conversation could take us. And we could talk for a couple of hours, and I think we almost need a part two. So let's maybe look at that at another time because um yeah, the experience that I have seen with you guys, and I suppose I know because I have had the incredible honor and pleasure of working with a number of current and retired Paralympians as part of the Paralympic Speakers Program and the program that we got to create together. So I know you as the incredible humans that you are. And to be able to work with you is great, but because it's different, it scares people. And you can see your disability, other people's you can't. And then we get diversity sometimes reduced to, race, gender, or just some token program. So, what do you see as the risk when we treat D, E, and I as a checklist rather than a real change in how we work?
Yeah. I think first and foremost, given that I'm on your, podcast and we're having this conversation, well, the biggest risk is the potential psychosocial hazard and the trauma involved. We look at, uh, diversity and, marginalized groups, and we know the stats are there that they're at greater risk of bullying, discrimination,
Mm,
harassment. We also see greater unemployment and underemployment rates. So we really need to be mindful of the program, that making sure that it's supporting our individuals rather than harming them. But I
mm,
suppose that's the end result that we're trying to avoid. If we go back a step, maybe,
mm.
then the biggest risk I see is that it becomes, performative.
Yeah.
You end up, with shiny brochures, diversity stats on a website or in an annual report, but day to day, nothing really changes. People can feel that disconnect. And what that does is it creates a lot of mistrust. And when we, um, when we treat inclusion as more of a compliance exercise, we just tick the box and then
Mm,
we move on. But we actually haven't built uh, the habits or behaviors that make a real difference.
mm,
Um, real inclusion is cultural. It's how the
yeah.
decisions are made, um, whose voices are heard,
Mhm.
and who gets the opportunities.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and then when organizations get that wrong, we can see the opposite of that. We can see resentment,
Hmm.
diversity fatigue, diversity inclusion fatigue, and sometimes a backlash that comes with that. You know, but when we get
Yeah.
it right, it can be very powerful. Teams become more creative, safer,
Yeah.
um, and somewhat more adaptive.
And that brings me to another point, right? They sometimes the efforts focus on that surface level fixes or the visible, and we're doing this, we've got this badge, we accept this person, we do this thing on this day. But as you said, it misses that deeper, the day-to-day, the barriers that actually impact people's ability to participate. And I know we've had a lot of
Yeah.
conversation offline about this, which is why I wanted to ask you this question publicly, and give organizations an opportunity to avoid that kind of disconnect. What can they do to avoid that?
Probably the number one thing that I've seen, and I think it's the most important, is you need to build relationships.
Yeah.
You talk, you briefly mentioned earlier on that um, sometimes there is that discrimination because people are different,
Mm,
and we know that humans aren't wired to generally build relationships with people that are different because it may make them feel uncomfortable or it might challenge some of their own
mm,
biases or some of their own norms and how they perceive things. So we really need to take the time to build those meaningful relationships. Um,
yeah.
yeah, I- and probably looking at where organizations start their diversity inclusion journey. A lot of organizations start, with awareness campaigns, training sessions, which are fine. But when we're talking about going a little bit deeper than the surface level, we really need to dig deep into the systems, um, the systems and the frameworks that shapes uh, our employees' experiences day to day,
Yeah.
and making sure that it doesn't get lost in the details of everyday work.
Yeah. And it reduces people to almost to, and we do this all the time, the label, right?
Yeah.
And then people are treated or as that homogenous group, and underrepresented groups are often treated as, well, here's the label, here's the badge, you're the this, instead of, as you were saying, treating people as individuals. What's the big danger here? Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
I, yeah, this one I really it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, and I have especially someone in a wheelchair, and I remember this is probably going off track a little bit. It's a, a bit of a story, and I was doing back when I was still competing, and I was doing a leadership program run by a pretty well-known former Olympian, and they sort of, in introducing themselves, boasted about how good they were they have a superpower of remembering everyone's names.
Mhm.
And I was like, great. But there was myself, and there was probably only 10 people in the group for 2 days. And there was myself and someone else in a wheelchair as well. And for those 2 days, we were known as, not by Cameron and so and so, but as the wheelies. Every time she talked to someone, yeah, or talked about someone, we always got labeled as the wheelies, not as individuals, but we all had to get, everyone else was an individual. And where, um, their names were used, but yeah, we were the wheelies. So I really, I really struggled with that, and I really regret not pulling the individual up at the time.
Mhm.
Probably now that I'm a bit older and crankier, I I wouldn't have a hesitation of going, no, no, my name's Cameron.
Yeah.
There's more to me than the wheelchair. So look, it's probably assuming, organizations assuming that everyone in a group all share the same experiences.
Mhm.
All females want flexible work. Everyone with a disability all needs the same adjustments, if
Mm.
any. And while it might be well intended, it just ends up flattening, I suppose, um, an individual's identity, you know.
Mm.
And you end up having people in those groups that actually feel unseen, even though the programs are meant to support them. They are invisible within that program.
Yeah.
Um, so it's really important that we understand and we recognize everyone's stories and everyone's background and really focus on the intersectionality
Mm.
of every group member. And when leaders take the time to understand people and to build those relationships, inclusion grows, it becomes more relational
Mm.
and less transactional.
Yeah, and there's not often not bad intentions with
Right.
people grouping people and label and supporting this label or that day or whatever. But it's when you package people up, as you said, and I remember from a conversation, I need to connect you with this person if you're already not connected, but a conversation with someone in a big organization. They were saying they did their DEI program and they got it designed and they had someone in a wheelchair on the front cover doing the whole freedom with the hair blowing back the rest of it on a hill and using that as, the inclusive imagery. And sometimes when you do things like that, it makes people feel not so great. It makes people feel
Yeah.
like you are labeling and you're assuming something, and it's really about having a conversation or involving and including people, right? Like, we have had a few chats about how workplaces can set up their D&I programs for success, and you've got some incredible tips, tricks, thoughts, frameworks, systems, structures. Can you share some of those with us today?
Y- Yeah, and I've thought about this. I think about this a lot to make sure that, because when we talk about, like earlier on, performance and inclusion and making sure that
Mm,
everyone has the ability or or the ability to reach their potential in terms of performance. Um, and thinking about this, one of the first things, and I've been involved in a number of conversations with a number of organizations, is to find out find out what your diversity, representation is now. Build
mm,
programs for these guys, not to try and attract people, because that's one way of alienating people, right? It's like, okay,
yeah.
and get their input. Make sure the amount of um, uh, programs and strategies that I've been or haven't been involved about, I've heard them on this, oh, they're doing this. I'm like, hold on.
Hello.
Yeah. I know I'm the only person in a wheelchair in this organization. Conclusion. Um, you know, so first of all, it starts with the intent, knowing why you're doing it is really important. Um, is it about improving performance, safety, innovation, engagement? Once you're clear on that,
Mm,
you can start designing something that's meaningful and it's going to have a lot of impact. Um, and linking that through to a business function, I think is really important. We hear a lot about, when you're trying to sell the story of D&I, to get some budget for it, we hear a lot about how diversity is good for business performance, return on investment, how it's good for safety stats. But I've never seen a D&I initiative rolled out by a commercial or finance team. I've never seen a D&I initiative rolled out by a safety team.
mm,
Generally, and generalizing, it's rolled out by HR people and culture or somewhat like that.
Yeah.
not by all these business functions that it's supposed to be, really good for. So probably moving away from the traditional siloed approach as well and being more holistic in
Yeah.
how we look at inclusion and diversity. I think there's a lot of information there now around, if we treat them as siloed
Mm.
programs. So we have a gender program, we might have an Indigenous program. You know, we run the risk of further marginalising those groups if they're not supported correctly. And we mentioned earlier on what happens, where we get a little bit of backlash and resentment and fatigue. So why aren't we doing more inclusive D&I programs
Mm.
um, rather than sort of exposing groups as siloed programs? And why aren't we then, like I said before, why are the programs not permeating at all levels of our organisation? You know,
Mm.
and then the most important part is if we're going to run a program, we need to make sure it's supported well.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that we've got the right supports in there for those individuals because, like I said before, we know that diversity groups are at higher risk of bullying, harassment, discrimination. So we need to make sure that we are putting supports in there,
Mm.
um, so we're not increasing those rates.
Yeah. It feels kind of similar to psychosocial hazards in the way that it's treated at the moment, because often that's either an argument between work health and safety or HR. Sometimes it's, working together. Sometimes it's just HR because all of those hazards are normally, the majority of them are managed by there. And do you think, I think kind of for almost for both of them, do you think the reason why people don't either take it seriously or invest time and resources into it is because we're so busy, organizations are so busy, there's so much going on, and there's so many things to do these days that it kind of just gets pushed, as I see psychosocial safety and hazards, to the either too hard or not now or maybe later or only if something happens? Do you think the same
Yeah, I
way?
think so. I think the story that we're telling is that it's a people problem, not a business problem. If we look at it as a business problem and we look at it not as a side project, actually as a part of that business, and if we look at it, this it's not an initiative, it's actually a business program.
Yeah.
And we are holding the people within that program accountable. We're
Hmm.
providing the supports that they need to perform, and
Yeah.
they are going to perform. And then we
Yeah.
need to make sure that we have upskilled our leaders, especially middle management as well, that are managing the day to day, that they have the capability to hold those conversations that they need to,
Mm.
those challenging conversations where we are holding people within those programs accountable for their performance and be
Yeah.
really clear on what are your your metrics, make sure that we can measure it, not just go, okay, how many individuals do we have in the program, but measure it with intent,
Yes.
because what we measure, we can then manage.
Yes.
And then, yeah, and it's not, it's not a side project. It's not a feel good project. It's actually, it can change the way the business performs. There's so many times I've sat in meetings going, well, we're underperforming here, here, and here. How are we
Mm.
going to change it? And then they roll out another program that's probably just been dusted off, you know, 10, 15 years, you know, from when it was last year. I was like,
Yeah.
well, there's a way that's it's staring you in the face, but no one really wants to look at it because we don't sell the story correctly.
Yeah. I love that. It's a business it all should be a business program. And you need to take it
Yeah.
seriously because the benefits and risks are really serious as well, but making sure that both sides are supported for success because they're not. They're often just here's a checkbox. Leaders don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Individuals who are
Yeah.
in the labeled group don't know what to do, and then we wonder why they fail. So yeah, I love that.
But so we hear these, we've got to reach these targets And generally, the intent is, or the program is because another rival company is doing it, right? Crap, they're doing it, so we need to do it, so we all look like we're, but 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 we don't know why.
Yeah.
We don't know how. We don't know how to have the conversations. Again, we don't know how to build the relationships for everyone to perform.
Yeah.
Um, the program fails. We go, okay, we tried it. It didn't work out. Let's move on.
Yeah.
And there's a car wreck back there, right, of people
Yeah.
just, yeah,
Yeah.
again, being exposed to all that, this trauma.
Yeah, the destruction, like, yeah, it's so
Yeah.
true. Um, we could honestly talk for hours about this. But what's one thing that you want leaders that are listening today to take away if they're serious about building truly inclusive environments?
I think it's touching on what we've sort of talked about.
Yeah.
Is that it, inclusion isn't an initiative.
Mm,
You know, it's a leadership mindset. It's
yeah.
how that leader shows up every day. It's in the questions you ask, the people you listen to,
Mm,
decisions you make when no one's watching. I know everyone talks about that, but it's also, and we know that it's also the actions you take in front of people, calling out behavior that isn't acceptable because
mm,
that has the biggest impact. If someone sees the leader calling out behavior rather than ignoring it,
mm,
that's impactful.
mm.
Um, it's leading with morals and speaking up for those that don't have a voice. You know, Leading amorally and ignoring certain behaviors is just as damaging as leading immorally.
Yeah.
If we ignore behaviors, um, and if you're serious about inclusion, I've talked about building relationships.
Yeah.
If you're really serious about inclusion, start with curiosity.
Yeah.
You know, like I said before, ask yourself whose voice is missing, whose story haven't I heard, who
Yeah.
do I need to know more about? Um, and then when you find those answers and you receive those answers, then act on some of the things that you're being told.
Mm,
And just remember, inclusion benefits everyone. It's not just for the person directly involved.
mm.
It does benefit everyone. And when people feel safe and respected, we know that teams become stronger, more creative, more resilient, and eventually perform better.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we say about creating a psychologically and a socially safe environment is build those relationships, understand who is, and that's your role as a leader, right? With everyone, understand who they are. Don't put a label on them and then think that they're in this group, so I treat them this way. Everyone in your
Yep.
team is an individual, so treating them as they want to be treated, how they need to be supported. And it should be happening for you as well as a leader with your leadership too. We often do the best we can with what we've got. And sometimes we don't get enough to support us in success, which is why you're, really focusing on that sort of stuff with perception performance. And did you want to add something to that?
No, no, it's just all true. It's like, if the leader has the ability to build relationships, and role model the expected behaviors,
Yeah.
and it goes two ways. Once you build that relationship, then you're sort of talking about the stuff that you need as a leader from the people underneath you.
Yes. Exactly. Exactly. Oh, Cam, thank you so much for this chat. I do think we need a part two. We'll come back to it if we need to. But what's the
Brilliant.
best way for people to connect with you or learn more about perception performance?
Yeah. I'm learning a little bit more about LinkedIn. Not that I'm overly active, but that's one way. LinkedIn. I have a website, perceptionperformance.com.au.
Yeah,
And you can read more about there where we focus on leadership, inclusion and performance, and setting up the environments, that are going to enable all people to perform at their absolute best.
yeah. And
Mm.
completely feel included as well. I know that, you've been invited or not invited to events in the past, and you always call, and I make sure I do this as well to make sure that you can actually access the building because sometimes that doesn't happen.
It it happens more times than I would like it to happen. Yeah, crazy.
Which is interesting in 2025.
Yeah, yeah. There's still a long way to go.
There is, unfortunately. Cam,
Yeah.
again, thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we wrap up for the day?
No, I just thank you very much for having me. This is a really important topic. I know it's getting hopefully it's getting a little bit more traction now about the importance of diversity and inclusion.
Yep.
So thanks for having me. And this is why a middle-aged white guy is on your show, feeling like he has the capability of talking about diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, and you've got such a unique perspective. Everyone has a different and unique perspective, and I love what you bring to it. So thank you for coming on, having this honest chat, and for the work that you do. You know, I am a cheerleader and a fan of everything that you do. So thank you so much. And for listeners out there, if you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe and share it. We'll see you next time on Under the Rug at Work, where we continue to shine light on issues that are too often overlooked. Thanks, Cam.
Thank you. Bye-bye.